Hey everybody, my name is Darren Calhoun. My pronouns are he, him, and I serve on the board for Q Christian Fellowship, and I'm one of several people who work on our equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts. Here in this gathering, this is an important part of how we make sure that the values of EDI are integrated into our everyday conversations. We hold this monthly gathering on the second Sunday, and we discuss various topics, everything from gender to race to ability. All kinds of things are part of this conversation about belonging. And so we typically facilitate this as presentations from people within our community, as well as guests who join us from outside of our community. And our goal is to increase belonging in every way. We do this additionally at the board and the staff level, where we work to ensure that diversity and inclusion are reflected in our speakers, in our events, in our locations, and our policy. So, we are making sure that the entire QCF organization and community is a place where everyone belongs. That isn't something that happens overnight, and it's not something that happens without much work and much effort. And so tonight we have a few guests, a few friends of Q Christian Fellowship who are going to help us explore the patriarchy and what that means within the LGBTQIA community. I'm really excited about this topic, and this is going to be a fishbowl format. So it's just friends, some who are new, some who have known each other for a long time, having a conversation. In these kinds of conversations, you're more than welcome to use the chat to ask questions, to think out loud. But we do really encourage you to have a a listening posture, and to again, just kind of reflect and see what comes up. Lastly, if you are looking to learn more about this or what we do, feel free to check out qchristianfellowship.org or qchristian.org, I should say. And uh, and yeah, we've got all kinds of resources from our past gatherings as well as other things that you can link to. And so with that being said, I'm going to hand it over to our panelists or to our fishbowl participants to introduce themselves and to tell us, yeah, to just give us a little very short something to say who you are and where you come from. So I'm gonna add in our friends at the moment, real time. Okay, feel free to popcorn and jump in with introducing yourself. I love it. Everyone's so patient. Uh, I'll I'll tag Tasha.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Tasha Mitchell. I might know some of you. I can't see all of the boxes. But I have been participating in Q with Q alongside of Q for almost 10 years now. My first conference was in 2015. I've been an affinity gathering leader, she, her pronouns. I live in Chicago now. I am a PhD student here, and I am the new director of student and educator programs at an organization called Interfaith America. And I am happy to be here.
Awesome. And you can pass it off, Tasha.
And we'll go with Myles because you are right next to me on my screen.
Thank you, Tasha. I'm Miles. I use he, him, or they, them pronouns. I um, have a similar timeline to Tasha. I've been around Q for 10 years now. 2014 was my first official um, conference, and got signed up online very shortly after then. I am Native Hawaiian, Japanese American. I am transgender, and non-binary and queer, and currently living in Los Angeles, but spent most of my life in the South, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina. So it's nice to be on the West Coast here, closer to Hawaii. But a lot of my framework and experience around topics like gender and sexuality come from a context of growing up in the Deep South in the US. Currently, I work for a nonprofit called Trans Lifeline, and we offer crisis financial and emotional support to trans and non-binary folks through our hotline and through a microgrants program. And yeah, one of the reasons I'm excited to be a part of this conversation is that I often will share with people that I have two life projects that I am the most passionate about. One is something that some folks call like re-indigenation, reconnecting with my Native Hawaiian lineage and making sure that that culture and way of life is continued and perpetuated and affirmed, both in my family, but in the world more broadly. And the second is I call the project of manhood, what it means to live out a healthy and constructive way of being a man or masculine person in the world. So thanks for having me. I can't wait to chat. Katie, why don't you go ahead?
Thanks, Miles. Hi, everybody. I'm Katie Fong. I use she, her pronouns, and this is my first official interaction with Q. I come to you in this group through Carrie, who is a colleague and co-conspirator. We work together in our consulting practices, and we met in a master's program in organizational change management at the New School University in New York. I came there from a corporate career in executive search and wanting to do something different and do something that would help me to make the organizations out there in the world more humane. And so now, following that program and together with Carrie in a number of contexts, I work in a consulting role to support organizations to explore what's going on within their cultures, what's happening internally, and how do humans together have the ability to, unstick some of these systemic issues that make it hard for us to support each other to thrive. And so my work is about, making humans more able to treat each other better and to be more humane. And that means exploring and unpacking systems like patriarchy that show up because it's how we were all acculturated together as we were raised. I'm coming to you from the Finger Lakes region of New York State. I live in Aurora, New York, with my partner, Abby, and our 3 animals. And so I'm out here in the middle of farm country. I'm originally from Long Beach, California, so fellow Southern Californians out there. And then I spent a lot of time in Philadelphia growing up and have been in New York State since the early 2000s. And I think that's all you need to know about me for right now, but I'm happy to be here.
Good deal. Go for it, Carrie.
I was gonna ask a first prompt. That's okay. Yeah, all right. So, Miles, Tasha, and Katie. The prompt is this. This is one of those word association games. What's the first thing you think of when you hear the word patriarchy?
It's hard to play that game because I've been thinking about patriarchy all day in preparation for this. And so I'll say what comes to me now in this moment first is Bell Hooks. She's who I think of when I think about these systems, and I think about these systems as interconnected. And so it's never just patriarchy, because I am a student of Bell Hooks. It's always the white supremacist, imperialist, capitalist patriarchy. That's how the full concept comes to me. But it shows up in roles like gender. And so that's how I'll bring it a little bit closer to more everyday language.
The first word that came to mind when I was prompted was dominance. this just strong, forceful power imbalance. This idea of like that I have to like there has to be something that dominates, and there has to be something that is dominated. And so this interesting power role of like who fits into the role, who fits into the category of who gets to dominate and who gets to be dominated. And oftentimes this is not necessarily something that the dominated get to choose. It's normally this one group that is the dominating group and the societally dominating group. And so that's the thing that comes to mind first when I think of patriarchy.
I have like a pop culture visual that comes to mind. And for folks who saw the Barbie film, it's the scene where Ryan Gosling's character like discovers patriarchy, and there's a montage that plays, and you see dollar bills, you see dead presidents, you see weightlifters, you see car races. It's just like this sequence of everything Katie and Tasha have mentioned. It's toughness, it's anti-femininity, and it's power, and the way that like money controls all that. And it's like no coincidence in that film that he's like in the financial district of LA. He's in Century City. And so when I live very close to there, when I drive through it, I think about that scene and how it unfolds, and it's just it's loud, it's obnoxious, and there is a part of it though that um, I find myself like wanting to laugh at, because it's an exaggeration, it's a caricature, and like it represents something that's very true, and has been led to tremendous violence throughout human history. And so when I think of patriarchy, I just think of like that kind of montaging, like of the world we've lived in.
Yeah, and I'm also just thinking about power in general, the ways that yeah, our relationship to power and how it's been shaped so much by some of the values or some of the attributes we've assigned to men and to maleness. Um, but yeah, I'm looking forward to us really digging through some of that and get into the nuanced ways that it shows up.
So there's a lot of things that have already come into the space that we can kind of work from. Um, Words like, economics or capitalism, words like dominance, words like power, um, that series of images that display a particular type of maleness, and the ways that that's enacted are just some of the ones that have stuck for me in your responses. And then this idea that it's based in values, that it's not just kind of out there, but that we're socialized into ways of being or ways of thinking. So it's open for any of our guests to kind of respond to each other or respond to this idea.
I was just going to comment, Miles, when you were talking about Barbie, immediately when you said that, the imagery came to mind of seeing all of the newspaper articles about people saying like only in a patriarchal society would a movie about patriarchy lead to the one male like cast member being the one who gets nominated for an Oscar in the film. And it was just like
And
the
ironically,
irony, but it was so true. It's like we literally are making a whole film about this. And the
Yes.
only person that gets nominated for the Oscar is the one male in the film. And so that was just like, for those who are like, oh no, this is not relevant. And then to have that happen, it's like, no, this is very relevant. Like art is imitating life, life is imitating art. And this is a very real example, almost immediately, right?
Yeah.
And so I just
Yeah.
wanted to bring that up.
Yeah. I'm curious, for Tasha and Katie, beyond some of these like word associations, I'm thinking it's very easy in these conversations, like for it to become like pretty academic, for it to become um, like rooted in sort of these like philosophical like concepts. But do you have simple, or just more straightforward definitions of things um, like misogyny and like sexism and sort of like how those fit into patriarchy? Like how are those three things in relationship with each other to you, and what have you found in your work and just lived experience around those things?
Yeah, I'll say I think that a way that I've tried to find it, I've tried to make systems like that can feel really, amorphous, more present and noticeable is in how we um how we express our values and our expectations through just the ways that things like the ways that the word should shows up for us. When I say something like, oh, I should do it this way. I should uh for as a feminine person, the constant feeling of should my body look different than it is? Should I wear certain things? Should I do this? Or the ways that in relationships I feel an obligation to be a certain way. That is a value set showing up implicitly. That is another system being expressed through my own internal thought process. And so much of that gets ingrained to a point that it really isn't conscious, or it really can't be conscious until we notice that we are feeling that pressure from some other expectation. And I try to help others and help clients to notice when should is coming forward, to ask why, to say, well, it says who, according to what? And did we choose that should on purpose? And do we want to keep that should? Does that feel like a should that is useful here? Or do we want to figure out how to make another rule or another expectation, to lift that burden off of ourselves? Does that make sense? And does it answer your question?
I would say like the role of othering comes into conversation with this, like just this concept of there is a standard, there is a norm in these systems, right? And then everything else is an other in relation to that standard or that norm. And sometimes that can be a little bit academic, but this idea like this is the standard for how we should exist, right? Or this is the standard for ideal. And in a patriarchal society, it is cis het masculinity, and that comes with all of these things. And then everything is really oriented around that. Everything is an other in comparison to that. So we see and especially I grew up evangelical, charismatic evangelical. I was just at a summit this whole weekend and we were talking about all of this. From our own religious traditions. But growing up, it was like masculinity and maleness is kind of the center, and then everything kind of emanates out of that or revolves around it. And so living in a system where the standard is masculinity and a certain form of masculinity, right? Like cis het normative. And I'll talk about this a little bit more, but this like heteronormative way of existing still revolves around what it means to be masculine, and then everything else is either in opposition to that or different than that. And so really in patriarchy, we have a system where the norm is maleness and masculinity, and then everything else is subject to that.
Even the people who subscribe to or ascribe to maleness, right? There's a control within that about who gets to be masculine. What does it mean to be masculine? What counts as masculine? And what are you allowed to do if you're somebody who wants to present as masculine, or who aspires to be male, or to be a man? And how does that dominance become imposed as well on that person? And how are they expected, therefore, to dominate others as a result? That's
Yeah.
another show that comes up.
And without making this a current events conversation, there's a really interesting dialogue about being perceived as masculine versus feminine, when it comes to the Olympic boxer who is uh, a brown woman, and her she is cis-identified in all the ways, but because she's not perceived as feminine by Western white ideals, there's a trope of perceiving her as more of a threat, perceiving her as more masculine and so forth. More so because she falls out of um, white ideals for femininity. Um, I'm curious, has anybody been following or hearing that, or could just comment on the racial aspect that comes in when we talk about masculinity and femininity?
Yeah, I mean, even if you're not on purpose trying to follow what's going on, it's going to present yourself if you're on the internet. Um, and I've thought a lot about this because I'm somebody who grew up playing girl sports, and benefited tremendously from that and became who I am today, in large part because of all of the lessons I learned around collaboration and teamwork and strategy and um, discipline. You know, all of those things were essential in helping me form a healthy like identity and desire to live. And I tell people all the time, like as a queer, trans, brown person in the deep South, it was athletics that allowed me to believe like I had worth and I mattered. And so for as long as like the trans and sports conversation has been happening and all the different peripheral conversations that have happened as a result of that, I've paid attention, you know, and thought a lot about it. And I think something that I've seen some of these articles talk about is that quote unquote sex testing has been happening to women for a long time in the Olympics and has specifically been happening to Black and brown women in the Olympics. And that's in large part because masculinity and femininity are culturally constructed, which means they are racially constructed. And when it comes to how, and this is true for people regardless of gender identity, like how um, masculine somebody presents, it's how far away from um, Asian and indigenous lineages they can be. But if then they are more masculine, which is what Black and brown identities are considered, than white masculinity, then that's when it becomes a threat. And so then that gets mapped like onto girls and women's athletic experiences as well. And so to me, this is actually more of a conversation about racism in the Olympics than it really is about gender, moreover, the participation of transgender people in sports. And that I think that's what needs to be so many people's takeaway is that that's what this is about. Is it's race and ethnicity. It's not her gender that is being policed and eradicated, you know, from participation in sport.
And also acknowledging the harm that's being done to trans folks in the process, right? Like, what is the root of the conversation, and then what should the takeaway be, and also where's the harm, right? And there's harm in multiple places. When I think about this idea of policing and when does self-policing happen, or when does that comparison to what type of masculinity happen, I think within all of us. I think about the shoulds for sure. And then I also think about like the way in which we self-identify versus the way in which we enact ourselves into the world. So what does performance of gender look like? What is performance of the ways in which we're conditioned to behave in social settings? How does patriarchy show up in those spaces? Like not just who do I understand myself to be, but who am I when I'm with, and then insert context here. And I'm just wondering if folks have any responses to this idea of context shifting when you catch yourself noticing patriarchy, or when you catch yourself enacting misogyny or reacting to misogyny or something like this.
I would say I've done this work more in my adulthood. So I mean, everybody's coming out story is unique and different, but I came out when I was 24 and solidly up until 18. Until I was 18, never had an attraction to someone of the same gender, never had an attraction to a woman. Um, and so had this interesting 6 years where I was trying to figure that out. But up until that point, like Miles, I played sports growing up. And I remember distinctly, and I've reflected on this since then, but I didn't have the tools to do it at the time. I remember distinctly being very, very afraid that people would assume things about me because I was an athlete. I didn't want to be perceived as being gay because I was a boy crazy teenager in high school. And solidly, right? And so I was a little bit masculine because it's not uncommon for athletes, right? Female athletes to be perceived as masculine or seen masculine. I played basketball, I played soccer, I ran track. I would have sweats on, I'd be wearing Jordans or whatever. And so I didn't show up as your typical very feminine woman or girl in high school. And I distinctly remember the anxiety that I had about, I hope people don't think I'm gay. And I didn't identify as gay. I wasn't attracted to women at the time. Maybe it was just latent. It was just waiting to develop, and we can talk about that another time. But yeah, just how that shows up, and even like that internalized homophobia, or just the way that I was perceiving the world too, because that is another way that patriarchy shows up. It's saying that like that othering again, like you are straight, and then the other is everything else, and we don't want to do that because that is not feminine and that's not in line with who you should be. And so I had that very real experience of just being terrified of like, and thinking like seeing other women who, or other girls who are masculine, being, oh, she's definitely gay, right? And just having that fear about what that means or what that would mean and how that would impact me socially.
Mhm. I'll share a sort of related and in some ways opposite and yet still harmful story, which is around my own coming out and being I was around 18 or so, and coming out to adults in my life who would say how relieved they were that I was still dressing like a girl, even though I had come out as a lesbian, as queer, and finding that to be really odd, and then later finding it to be alienating, to feel not seen and not, not like I belonged, because that was something that I had to continue to do. And even though I continued to want to be a feminine presenting person, that felt like an erasure of some part of me. And then, because we're also talking about how does patriarchy show up in queer spaces, presenting as feminine and being being somebody who always has partnered with same-sex people, it it rendered me and my partners typically invisible within those spaces and therefore not valid within those spaces. I've always been a feminine person who was attracted to other feminine people. And so when we're in spaces together, my partner and I, my other partners in the past, we weren't noticed or seen or recognizable as queer often, because queer spaces so often look for those same signifiers. It's really interesting, of a sort of a heteronormative pairing, to know, even though we're in a queer space, who's with whom and who belongs here.
Yeah, one thing I was reflecting on before our time today, related to Katie, your reflection here is how this specifically plays out in queer spaces. And for me, before I was able to affirm my trans identity, I was very connected to lesbian, queer women, sapphic communities. And so that's where I was politicized. And I tell people all the time, set free and made whole. And moving from predominantly like queer women spaces into now I'm in Los Angeles. I spend a lot of time in West Hollywood, predominantly queer men's spaces. I have like this sort of comparative analysis of what it's like to be in one versus the other. And I'm not like upholding the binary here. There are many nuances between these spaces. And the broad strokes I'm going to paint here are related to looking at them as very distinct from each other. And for me, one of the ways like I see patriarchy as a system and then misogyny, like this devaluing, if not hatred, of women and femininity appear is in like the invisibility or the absence of queer women in these spaces. So you'll have cis het women who show up and can be welcome. Not that they're always that way. I think it's a common trope about bachelorette parties that like show up to like gay bars and wreak havoc and chaos, upon the community. But I've seen the way that like cis het women can have room, can have space, can experience a kind of elevated role in like a queer men's space, but that is not true for queer women. Um, Another way I've seen this be true is related to how queer men will denigrate and perform repulsion to women's bodies or just not cis men's bodies and anatomy. And it's always kind of presented as a joke. It's always presented as lighthearted, but to me, it's representative of something that goes much deeper than that. And it gets excused because in the queer man's mind, like they're not the ones committing violence against women and femmes, and therefore they can make those jokes. But I do not appreciate them. And yet they're prolific. Some other notes I took were around how queer men get taught to hate their own femininity and to police that in others and to perform a kind of gay masculinity. You want to be able to signal to like other queer men that you are queer, but you don't want to signal that in a way which suggests, based on your perceived femininity, that you're like less than in that way. Another way I've seen this, which friends of mine on this call and I have talked about, is the way that queer men both shame themselves and shame other people around a bottoming sexual position. So, if that's how you show up sexually, because that's perceived or treated as the feminine role, there is self-hatred that comes with that. And often it looks like just making fun of yourself, laughing at yourself. But to me, it's the result of bullying and harassment in the culture around it. And that is directly tied to patriarchy. And then the last one I wanted to note is specific to like people of my gender experience. And so this is specifically about trans men and transmasculine non-binary people. But something that's very common in the community is, again, to mitigate femininity, try to manage it as much as possible, and to perform not just masculinity, but to perform toxic masculinity as a way to affirm our genders. And so there's quote unquote gender euphoria being found and acting like a cishet gym bro.
Mhm.
And to me, like this, some it's a problem. I'm going to call it a problem. But I see it in queer and trans spaces, and to me, it underneath that's misogyny. That is the result of kind of living in a patriarchal structure.
Yeah, I was going to bringing both you, Katie, and you, Miles's comments together. And I didn't know what language I could use, and so I'm glad you mentioned bottom, so I will use it since it has been introduced to the group. but thinking about some personal experiences and just some of the things that I've heard. One of my critiques of the queer community is that heteronormativity is too strong in our community. And I get it to some extent because there's a lot to lose if we don't subscribe to the norms, right? There's a lot to give up. But for example, I had a friend tell me that a guy told him that he was just too masculine to be a bottom. And I was like, and he found that commonly, right? And so there was this idea that it was not only is gender wrapped up in this, but then actual acts, right? So like acts are ascribed, right, to specific ways of being. Um, and so thinking about heteronormativity, like we can't even pull it apart from patriarchy because it is a function of patriarchy, right? Setting up those binaries, setting up those norms, again, the othering. This is the standard and then something else is different. I would say that I was very disillusioned when I came out and I started exploring my own sexuality. I am a biracial woman. My father is Black, my mother is white. And so I gravitated naturally into predominantly Black lesbian spaces. And for those of you who are familiar, there's a lot, my critique would be that there's a lot of heteronormativity in the Black lesbian community. I identify on the bi-pan spectrum now that I have that language and I've been able to explore my sexuality more. But I am a cis woman, but I identify as femme of center, and I kind of sit in this space where it's a little fluid for me, right? My expression isn't always in that binary. And so what I found when I came out and I was exploring was that I just never fit in a category that made people comfortable. Because they would be like, oh, you're too masculine for that type of woman. She wants a high femme. And I was like, okay. And then, I'd be attracted to feminine women feminine women. And they're like, you're not masculine enough. You don't wear this and you carry a purse. And I was like, well, dang, like, who am I supposed to? I'll just go back to dating men. That was a little bit easier, right? Um, and so finding that, running into that and still running into that. I'm in a relationship. My partner is very presenting, more mask identifying, sits kind of in a non-binary space, and we negotiate that and navigate that. But I think a lot of that still has to do with the world that we live in that says there's masculinity, there's femininity. Those two go together really nicely, right? And anything outside of that is going to present a challenge. And so that's from my own personal experience of how I've seen that show up and be very, very difficult to navigate and challenging.
I think we police each other a lot in queer spaces. Queer spaces are like super, super control oriented. And I have to think it comes from the ways that we interact with systems of oppression that affect us in other spaces. And we bring that in because, I mean, sort of, Myles, to your point, like we have to prove something, around, like what trans men do to perform so often masculinity. I've seen it. I went to a single sex college. I went to women's college. And so there was a lot of this like performative stuff that would go on where people were experimenting with gender identity. It was the thing that happened a lot. And there was a lot of that kind of control and policing. And I think it's about needing to unpack and explore and rebel in some cases against the systems that we're up against. But it's harmful. It's super, super harmful. I don't know what the solution is. These conversations, I think.
That was actually what I was going to ask, was like, if you have, like, how do we heal, and what are some ways you've seen, like counter narrative, to this being able to happen, and personally, professionally, anything like that.
Well, I think like with Tasha's story about like, oh, that kind of person isn't going to want somebody like you, like that person wants somebody more masculine or that person wants somebody more femme. I think it's those moments of like identifying that unspoken should and deciding if I want to take that on as my own or not. And I think that finding spaces and relationships where we can have those kinds of conversations and question the standard and say, okay, what would it look like if I didn't choose to care about that? What would it look like if I said, so what? And finding ways to just begin with ourselves and begin in the interpersonal and the one-to-one, to find that sort of fulfillment and empowerment and lift each other up that way. And then challenge it when we see it in other spaces. Why are we doing this? Why are we policing each other this way? What makes you want to do that? And actually engaging directly with it. This is some of the, Carrie mentioned, we started to talk about this conversation around this idea of interrogating whiteness, which is a bell hooks term. And I'd recommend Feminism is for Everyone as a great starting point for bell hooks for those that aren't familiar. And she's got lots of other good stuff. But this one came out of, I'm going to try to find the quote. This one came out of a piece she wrote where she sort of, in a really, I don't know, colloquial way, was saying, I wish someone would explain to me what's going on with whiteness. We spend so much time talking about what's happening inside Black culture, but I wish someone would just sometimes tell me what's going on with whiteness. And I think that that's what we can do with patriarchy, is we can say, all right, how is this coming up here? What are we seeing here? Is this patriarchy? Feels like it might be. What would it mean? What would it look like if we just tossed that aside and lived with our humanity as it shows up and as it best empowers us? What would that look like? Maybe that's a beginning. But I love other ideas.
I was just going to say I would definitely second that. And I would say I am not nailing this. Even I am almost 40 years old and still have been on this journey for 14 years of trying to figure out who I am, what I am half the time. And so I'm still on that journey, but a part of that has been constantly challenging myself to grow comfortable with myself in spite of all of the boxes that the world tries to put me in, right? I remember I went on a date with somebody and I was trying to vehemently explain how I showed up as a bi-pan person. And the person that I was on a date with, who unsurprisingly I do not talk to anymore, was basically like, but then why not just identify as a lesbian? Because the idea of like masculinity, like me being attracted to it, which was so odd because they were a mask presenting woman, which I was kind of like, this should affirm you in some way that I'm attracted to masculinity, but not that type of masculinity, right? And so even having to constantly negotiate and having to explain oneself, well, you're not exactly feminine, you're not exactly masculine, you're like something else. Or you're kind of attracted in this way, but something else, right? For me, that has been growing more comfortable in my own skin, being more confident in who I am, being able to explain myself, and doing that internal work. Like I said, I don't always hit it. I still struggle with it. Even me and my partner, in full transparency, still have to negotiate what this looks like I said, because she's more on the masculine presenting side of things. And so that does come up in our relationship, right? She once said, and she'll probably be mad at me for saying this, but she once said, like, it's not that, I don't appreciate that side of you, but I definitely appreciate the feminine side a little bit more, right? And so it's just kind of this like, and having to negotiate that, right? And so some people would be like, oh, how can you allow that to happen? It's like, we all sit in these spaces. If we were to be honest, we all still have these ways of thinking and we have to wrestle with them. And so I think us doing that internal work of wrestling with it, how it even still continues to show up in us, and then challenging ourselves to speak into that and grow in our own confidence and grow in our own ability to have these conversations and be really clear about where we stand, where the gaps still are, and being honest about that, transparent. So that internal work, I think, is really important.
I had a professor in college who, I wish I could remember the exact line, but described the reason why it is so important for us as humans to put people in categories as quickly as we can to understand who fits into what box. And the way they described it was, if I can understand what's going on with you, I can know how I'm allowed to interact with you according to the rules that live inside my head. And we absorb all of the rules that we're given, and those include the ways that gender is constructed, but it also includes, the religious ideology comes into this too, but we have all these rules that, and Carrie teaches this really well, how our brains can't process information quickly enough. There's too much information. And so we just make shortcuts and put people in boxes, just to get to a place where we can understand, where we can make meaning out of what's happening around us. And then in doing that, we can know what we're allowed to do. And there's a way to look at this generously, and to use sometimes the calling in instead of calling out if we can switch to that language and be a little more community oriented when possible. To say that when I'm trying to put you in a category to know how I can interact with you, it's to know how I can belong with you. It's to know how we can be together, so I can see your humanity. And often I'm wrong if I'm doing this really, really fast. But if I can learn to be more curious first and to worry less about how I need to belong and worry more about how I can support you to belong, then I can know you. Then I can know who you really are without needing to tell you what you have to be to interact with me. Maybe that's a way. I'm
Yeah,
gonna read it.
that's great. I'm glad this is being recorded. Yeah, I think both of those reflections, what that's bringing me back to, is a conversation I find myself having with men, cis, and trans experiences a lot, and that's around like that we're busted, and what does it mean to grow through that. And I have been slowly identifying different ways that I do think that, and this is true for everybody, regardless of gender identity or gender presentation. I remember for years I worked for a queer Christian organization that a lot of the teaching we did around the case for LGBTQ inclusion came back to helping people understand how the teaching of gender complementarianism has informed a lot of the exclusionary policies and positions that churches and denominations take against queer people. And in that conversation, I remember once um, in somebody reflecting on like the difference between like equality and equity and why that's important to consider. And something they said was that to heal from the problems of patriarchy, we're not going to get there through egalitarianism. We're only going to get there through feminism. And so I think all the time about how we like raise our kids to be feminist. And I think all the time about if that was not our upbringing, what are the ways that we unlearn and what are the ways we relearn? And to me, I know a critical part of being able to celebrate, affirm, and I believe like really love women has come from having had the permission all my life to look up to girls and women, to read books by girls and women, to subscribe to podcasts and follow the music written and created by girls and women. Later in my life, I became very interested in film. And so knowing like who like filmmaker women in film, who are they? Not just directors and writers and producers, but directors of photography, the cinematographers, who's actually shooting these films, and going out of my way in like every sector of society to figure out who are, and not just women, but women and non-binary people and more feminine presenting people who are leading, in these different spaces, and what can I learn from them specifically. So that to me is, it has to be like a part of the healing journey, is you just change like who's putting the data, before your eyes. Like who are you following on social media? Like what accounts are you taking in content from? And because all of that, and Carrie, I know you can talk, more about the neurobiology like of that, but to me it's how it's not the only way, but it's a significant part of moving forward together and being able to experience that belonging, is to work on the frames, that we have around um, why we like what we like, why we desire what we desire, why we're repulsed by what we're repulsed by, and um, starting there. So that's something I still try to make a big part of my life.
Could we use that as a maybe a jumping point to also talk about the tensions that there are to manage? For example, we've talked a bit about gender expression, about bi and pan experiences, and how patriarchy kind of especially is visible in policing those identities and those expressions and those relationships. And some have even highlighted how in the chat, some people have even highlighted how many of their friends, as cis gay men, aspire to be perceived as straight in their lives or relationships. What are the challenges? What are the things that we're navigating that maybe we don't always realize when it comes to living in a freer world, living in a post patriarchy future? What does that look like? Because I think some people might even assume that a post patriarchy future is just one where women are in charge. So let's break that one down.
I'll go back to the should conversation a little bit, and I was trying to figure out when this would be appropriate to share. So I remember one day I was in the car, I was driving somewhere, and there was a guy next to me, and he's like trying to get me to roll down the window, and I'm in DC. If you've lived in DC, you know, like we don't do that. Like I'm not rolling down my window in the middle of the street. But I like kind of crack it, and he was just like, so he's obviously trying to hit on me, and I told him I had a girlfriend, and his response to me was, "Oh, but you're so pretty." And so I think this also leans into these other isms and how, like, about bodies and about beauty and aesthetics, what this should have, like, not just how should we act and how should we behave, but how should we exist and actually show up in the world, right? Thinking about how my physical body, kind of going back to what you were talking about, like how the physical body should look when sitting in these specific camps, right? How I should appeal to people. And I think that is sometimes we don't often talk about, like the work that we do to appeal to even in the heteronormative spaces. I have had lots of conversations with my gay male friends who just talk about like the physical toll on their body sometimes that it takes to be in the gym and to be presenting a certain way, to be seen a certain way, or to not be seen as a, you know, I don't want to be perceived like what you were saying, as like a not pretty feminine woman, right? And like all of the ways that that shows up. So sometimes I think we have to talk about how we even contribute to that and how we show up to try to appeal to the appetite of other people. Because again, that goes back to someone is setting a norm for what how we should show up. And I think we don't do enough to talk about like how we a lot of times in the queer community still try to um situate ourselves in a way where we can appeal to the common appetite, right? And I hate to use that language, but that's kind of how what patriarchy does, right? It's like this is appetizing and this is not. And the appetizing things are the things that we should be moving towards and we should be pushing this out. But then it leads to a lot of conversation around not really allowing a lot of people to show up just as they are and recognize that different people love different types of people, lots of different ways of being beautiful and being attractive and being appealing. And we really, really denigrate a lot of ways of physically showing up in the world by acquiescing to these norms of what it means to be beautiful and appealing and wanted and desirable.
Mm-hmm. And it can feel really overwhelming to feel like we have to undo all of that, that we have to undo all of that within ourselves. And then we have to figure out how to get everybody else around us to start undoing all of that together at the same time. And I think a step toward living in the world we want to live in is to relieve ourselves of the burden of undoing all of it, all at once, and to figure out how to find the places where we have agency to create the communities, to create the worlds, the small worlds we want to live in, and start there and be in those spaces to the extent that they are restoring us and empowering us to build a little bit out of the bounds of that, to go a little bit farther and to say, okay, so I've got one little safe relationship I can live inside. I've got one friend across the world somewhere that I will accept me as I am, and begin with that. And then how do we expand that out to two friends who are in the Zoom room together that can do that? And then, but starting with, what are you empowered to do? And look toward, not, I have this huge list of oppressions I have to figure out how to disentangle, but to like, I have this great friend, I have this great community space that I can come to, I have this great place where I can come and have these exploring conversations where it's okay to say the wrong thing. That's a really important thing too, is to not police each other in our growth, to make space for mistakes because it's going to be part of it, and just to really value and nurture the small spaces where we can be whole. That's the beginning. We can't solve it all.
I love that. Thank you, Katie.
Thinking about the ways in which we're conditioned inside patriarchy, and then how that shows back up in ourselves and in our communities. And I'm specifically thinking about when vulnerability is permissible and when it's not, and when passing becomes the ideal in whatever ways we're expecting ourselves, we're shooting ourselves to pass, and how we inherit those concepts and practices from the world around us. And I'm wondering, I guess I'm wondering where that shows up for you all. I'll share, as a pretty young person, 7, 8 years old, around there, I really wanted to be a priest because I really wanted the access that the priest had in the church environment that I was in. And femme and women identified folks did not have that access. And I was very aware of desiring that and wanting to be a boy. And at the same time, I was very aware that I didn't know if I was desiring that from an identity perspective or if I was desiring that from an access perspective. And I don't know that I know the answer to that now, 30 whatever years later of questioning that. But I think that there's something even in a story like that, where recognizing the system, recognizing how power and access shows up, recognizing desire, recognizing identity, and then recognizing what is passing or what isn't, right? Like, what are the ways in which access allows or modifies the way, or what are the ways that passing gives us access or affords us additional access? So there's not a question there, it's more just a sharing, but I'm wondering if that resounds for other folks.
I'm thinking your reflection makes me think about the privilege of being socialized as male growing up, in that I was aware of certain power dynamics, but I saw people that looked like me, that looked like the experience that I was having as male, in those positions. So the division, the separation, even though I was intellectually aware of it, I didn't feel it until I thought about what that meant for you as a person who socialized in a female context, to engage spiritually, right? To be thinking about, what does it mean to be able to access God? What does it mean to have power in the church? What does it mean to be seen as a leader? Like, I have an interesting dichotomy of many of the churches, most of the key people who have shaped and led me have been women. And with the exception of my Catholic church experience, most of the powerful leaders in my churches have also been women. But there's always been some man somewhere existing just a step above all of that. And it always created for the most toxic kinds of dynamics, right? Where it was just like you are a powerful leader. Why do you need this dude? Like what's the value here? Um, but also thinking about that, what you're saying about vulnerability, um, another, growing up reflection. Uh, I did not know that it was not normal or not considered typical to be able to like go home crying and your father not make fun of it or not like tell you to buck up or toughen up when it came to being like teased at school or something like that. Um, like there are things that we get handed to us. There are things that we even replicate in others that that again come from this idea that vulnerability is less than uh even the as been as it's been mentioned, the idea of gay male sexuality being bad is the idea that it's rooted in being the woman being feminine. All the caricatures, rest on that. um but yeah, I'm just thinking so much about what our social, the technical term, our social location is. What is our identity development? What are the things that tell us who we are along the way that then inform how we see God, the universe, society, power, leadership, all of those things. And that, yeah, that's part of that continuing deconstruction. That's part of that continuing thing where we figure out why do we want to be straight passing? Why do we want to be cis passing? Like trans folks don't owe us being high femme or high mask. They don't owe us androgyny. And cis folks don't owe it either, right? Like there's so many things that we've assumed. And again, I've seen queer folks who are like, well, if you gonna transition, then make sure you look like a woman, make sure you look like a man. It's like, but why? What?
Mhm.
Yes, there's sometimes a safety reason to do something, or you can make choices about your own expression. But is it just to avoid the violence that we associate with being different? Is it just to avoid the ways that we harm people who don't fit into the standards that men created whenever? So, thoughts.
At a certain point, it becomes about avoiding the shame that we have attached to not conforming. Because it's not that we are in our own minds actually saying out loud to ourselves those words like I have to conform because otherwise I won't be whatever. It's that we've shortcutted it to if I don't, I have to do this or I'll feel ashamed. We don't even have words before we feel the shame. We've just been wired that way. So it's about finding the places that give us the opposite, find the places that give us that give us joy, that give us safety, that give us nurturing instead of shame. But yeah, I think so much of the pressure to pass in so many different situations is this very simple instinctive desire to avoid feeling shame.
And I loved how we did tie this back into belonging, right? This core human need. And as Brene Brown, often talks about that belonging is the opposite of so many of the things that we are trying to avoid, trying to fix. Um, and I part of me just feels like we don't fully realize what belonging is, right? We've been one of the key tenets to patriarchy. And I describe this to gay cis men often. We don't question in the same way if a gay man has a sexual relationship with a woman. Like that can happen. You're not going to be like, oh, he's secretly heterosexual. But we will question any moment of intimacy or closeness between two heterosexual men because the power dynamic is all on that male cisgender heterosexuality is fragile, and that any deviation from that is both less than and something that you can never regain. You can never become that again. Become a questioning person, you can become a bi person, you can become a woman, but you will not be that pristine ideal that doesn't really exist.
Mhm.
Um, and we're all just kind of working under, or many of us are just working under that idea without even realizing it. Um, and so I feel like it's one of those, I've gone so deep into that point, I lost my other point. But it's one of those things where we've just had the society that is so, so, so centered on the desire, perception, fears of a fragile construction of masculinity, that everything else is not only secondary, but it is it's where you land if you don't belong in that top position. I think that was the original point I was going for, of there's an ideal place and everyone else just has to make do. But even the men we consider ideal, hyper masculine or strong or stereotypically male, whatever, none of them are safe ever. And it's that lack of safety, it's that lack of place where you can just rest, where you can just be, that creates, I think, some of the violence and some of the constant, like, derision of, well, you're not really a man. If you're a real man, if you're really straight, all of those qualifiers that once you get kicked out, it's just like, oh, you're just whatever. You belong there. Just can't belong as a cishet man, which harms cishet men in the same way that patriarchy oppresses all of us.
Mhm. Tying that back to this conversation on passing, I couldn't help but notice in reading the bios, if my understanding is correct, we have three panelists that come from ethnic backgrounds that are not clean and neat and like, oh, this is this one homogenous thing, right? And so even looking at the context of the states, this is where I say I will have offer some hope. The United States is becoming more diverse. There will be more people like us who sit in these spaces that aren't cleanly defined by, well, are you Black? Are you white? Are you an Asian American? Or are you like a white American? Are you Pacific Islander? Or are you white? Like, where are you, right? Because we want to put people in these distinct categories. My hope is that as we continue to progress, as our experiences become more common, it would become more normalized to sit outside of the labels and the boxes that we place people in, because more people will have that experience and be like, oh, and I hate the idea of normative behavior because that's an othering thing too. But I think that, I guess a better language would be, I hope it becomes more common and acceptable and understood, this experience of not necessarily passing, but not having the need to pass, not having the desire to pass. If there were ever times in my life where I wanted to be white, it was simply because the Black side of me was demonized, or oppressed in some way. But I hope that we are moving towards a society where it's like I can exist in all of the diversity as one person, and that's just okay, right? It is not necessarily normative. It's just okay to exist in that space, right? To be biracial, to be multi-ethnic, to have a gender identity or a sexual orientation or an expression that is something different than what we, typically see as a binary. I'm hoping and I am hopeful that that will continue to happen to where we don't need to continue to have these passing conversations, where passing isn't the norm or the expectation.
Big amen.
Yeah, for sure. I'm the vulnerability question is so interesting for me because I since we're Bell Hooks has already been brought into the room, um, a book I read every year by Bell Hooks is all about love, new visions, and something that is striking to me, like in each read, is this idea of what it like looks like to create like a culture of nurturance for people. And I think there's like one particular chapter where she's talking about how um, we are like socialized to be liars. to lie to each other, to lie to ourselves, how common that is, how dismissed it is. And a part of lying um, is related to passing. Um, Even if when it's for our safety, even when it's for our survival, that is an artifact of a society that wants us to be liars to ourselves and to each other. And um, she'll claim that you can't love and lie simultaneously. And I took that to heart because people pleasing is a form of lying. And I think there are so many different ways that people, regardless of gender identity, are consistently doing that. And people pleasing prevents us from being able to be truly vulnerable. And if you can't be vulnerable, then I would argue that creating these cultures of nurturance are not going to really be possible. We can't experience being nurtured, and we cannot nurture the world around us if we are lying. And so that is something like I take to heart because I see it in my own life, um, on a consistent basis. And so I think kind of separate from that, I like to ask people, in friendships and, with partners, throughout their life, when they felt loved by someone, like what are the ways that that was shown to them? And usually they can describe different relationships that they've had. And a question I love to ask people of all genders, all sexual orientations, is when they've been loved by men, how have they experienced like loving, nurturing relationships with men? And for most people, that's a harder question to answer. And I think I because of the circles that I was in my sort of like coming to gender experience, I did not spend a lot of time um, thinking about constructive masculinity, thinking about what a healthy manhood would be like. It just like was not my area of focus, and it has been hard to identify good resources. People exploring this in a really deliberate and intentional way, and to me, so much of that is about vulnerability. It's so hard to be reflective um around like masculinity and femininity and feel safe because there is so much at stake when we talk about these things and we talk about disrupting, moreover dismantling a system. It creates danger, it creates risk. And um yeah, I want to think more about this because I am both somebody who considers myself an open book, but like, do I want to be vulnerable? No, and so there's something there that I want to spend more time with.
Yeah, it's reminded me of one of our speakers who was at the conference in January. I want to say Bishop Tolliver, but I'm not certain that I'm quoting the right name. But he did specifically talk about womanism and the piece from womanism. I'm not doing a good explanation, but the piece from womanism that stood out to me as so valuable is this idea of survival or protection in the larger context of all of our theological and all of our liberative ideas, because often the conversations coming from Black, typically male theologians, from various groups, from white feminism, has not incorporated this idea of survival, that incorporates this idea of how safety or making it through the liberation is so critical. And that's the piece that I'm like, this makes my theology make more sense, right? It's not just a coming king to wipe out all the evildoers, but it's we do have a surviving savior, if you will, somebody who's been through vulnerable stuff. And this is not a sermon, but somebody who's been through vulnerable stuff, and it pulls the pieces together for me of it's not about eliminating and extinguishing what we might perceive as the opposition, as much as it is how do we come back together? How do we reconcile all things? And it makes so much more sense. And again, like I said, I'm not describing it well, but through this womanist lens, it makes so much more sense. Um, so yeah, I appreciate that Miles, as you're reflecting on, I'm totally borrowing that question on how we've experienced love for men, because men have only been taught that love can be expressed through aggression, through possession, and the iterations of that are either, oh, my dad provided for me, or my dad was willing to fight and kill guys for me. Whatever it was, it's like, is this it? Is this the best? This is the best that we can do.
I always ask, like, did your dad wrestle with you? Did he tickle you? Did he make you laugh? Like, show you puppets? Like, that is more important to me than like if he protected and provided for you.
Exactly. Oh God, tough love. I Carrie mentioned tough love in the comments, and I'm like, I don't. I'm I'm gonna go out on a limb and say I don't know if tough love exists. I think it's a construct that we've called love, but I really do question if that idea is actually rooted in love, or is it these versions of protecting, domineering, enacting violence upon, and saying these are love. I've got to tell you it's love. I've got to reprogram you to recognize it as love. Because if anybody else did this under any other circumstances, you'd call it abuse, you'd call it harm. But I'm doing it because I love you. Not so much.
Actually, fear. It's fear, right? If it was love, it would be joyful, it would be nurturing, it would be warm, but it's not. It's constraining, and it is controlling, and it is dominating.
Right. It would endear that sense of belonging. You wouldn't
Right.
have to question yourself when
Mhm.
you're authentically loved. And again, this isn't to say that people who gave us tough love are horrible people. It's to say we are all socialized under a system, aka patriarchy, and a violence that teaches us. It rewrites for us the scripts that I think our hearts and our bodies understand what safety is, what belonging is. But then we get these things that tell us, no, 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 no. You don't know who you are until somebody tells you who you are. You don't know you're loved until somebody tells you that you're loved. And I think that's where we miss out. Um, yeah, we miss out on the fullness of our humanity because we're following these scripts that are being handed to us.
I wanted to comment really quickly on the womanist perspective. I am a womanist. I'm a womanist pastoral theologian. And I wanted to offer one piece of food for thought. As a womanist, I would argue that oftentimes when we think about justice, oh, did we get some animations here? I just saw that.
Sorry, is way more dramatic than I thought it was going to be.
Thinking about the conversation on love and liberation, I think sometimes it is our tendency to lean into the liberation of myself or my group. And what I would posit or offer is that if we are not concerned about the collective liberation of other people and other oppressed groups, then we're not going to solve this issue with patriarchy, because we're just going to get into a competition, right? Because I will think that once I have arrived, justice has been served. And that was one of the big things with womanist theology, womanist philosophy, is that, hey, there are groups of people that are being excluded from this conversation. So as a cis woman, if I am not concerned about my trans siblings and my non-binary siblings, I am not really fighting for liberation or justice, right? And so I would offer that in order to combat some of these things, that we really have to link our liberation to the liberation of other people across oppressed groups.
Mhm.
Thank you, Tasha. We are at 8:30 Eastern, so this is the end of our session tonight. I'm going to encourage everyone who is here as a witness, who's in the room observing and thinking and commenting in the chat, to maybe spend 5 to 10 minutes journaling after we get off the call in just a moment, and take some time to process everything that you've heard, to make some notes to yourself, to see what you want to explore later, to see what has shifted within yourself. So if you, on your way out, would like to leave 1 to 3 words in the chat as a reflection tonight, or an offering about what maybe you are taking away, feel free to do that, but you don't have to. And we are back together again in September. So first Sunday in September, and you'll see some announcements about that on the way out. So thank you.